Welcome to Reflections, a program that turns back the pages of history, revealing the lives of heroes of faith from the past. And now our host, Jonathan Griffin.
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the Higher Grounds podcast and today's episode of Reflections. Glad you tuned in today. And you know, in the day and hour in which we live, greatness in our minds nowadays seems to be directly equated to or directly related to ability in our society. And all of those people that don't have these abilities, this greatness, whether it be mental or physical, in our society nowadays, are deemed to be pretty useless, it seems. But in the economy of God, it's a very different thing. As Hudson Taylor, the great missionary, once said, all of God's giants have been weak men who did great things for God because they reckoned on God being with them. You see, there have been many a man who has started out to work for God who was naturally gifted. He was a smart man, a strong man. He was witty. He had all these abilities, but his work for God turned out to be a failure. At the same time, there has also been just as many a man who physically was pretty much very weak and had no abilities, and mentally he wasn't necessarily gifted, wasn't very smart man in of himself, but his work turned out to be a great success for God. And we could go over a number of reasons why this is so, but one of the simplest would be that a life trying spent to reflect the light of God and not trying to live for themselves is often the life that will shine the brightest for God. And such was the life of the man whom we're going to be talking about today, and that man was John Praying Hyde, as many called him. And from the very beginning, John's life seemed to be one set up for success and to be a great reflection of the Savior's life. He was born November 9th, 1865, to Mr. Smith and Miss Lucinda Hyde. And the good Reverend Smith Hyde, John's dad, was in and of himself a great man. And people said about him, I'm quoting here from different people, they said, he was a man of rare balance and proportion. His ministry was stamped with godliness, and he was a loving husband and a courteous leader and a true father to his half-dozen children, 3 boys and an equal number of girls. And Miss Lucinda, John's mother, was in and of herself a very sweet-spirited, music-loving, and high-minded lady of gentle birth, people said. And besides that, really, in the fact that John really lived the basic life of a Presbyterian mayor's son during those 1860s, very little is known of his youth. We know that he learned to love the ring of his godly father's voice in the public pulpit as well as at the home. And we know he loved to hear his father declare the saving power of the gospel to sinners, even though he himself was not saved. And he spent much time with his family around the family altar in his house. And this was one of the greatest influences in John Hyde's life as he grew up. And he would often go back in time in his thoughts and talk to others about what a great influence his father was, and specifically his father's prayer life, especially around the family altar with him. And family friends said of John's father and John's father's prayers, he said, I frequently heard Dr. Hyde pray to the Lord to thrust out laborers into his harvest. And he would pray this prayer very often, both at the family altar and from his pulpit as church. And this would be a very great influence on John's life in later years, this prayer for God to send laborers out into his harvest. And John would later on resound that call himself in his own ministry. But John, he continued living this normal life of a Presbyterian preacher's son during his early life. And when he came of age, he actually entered a local college, and he graduated, and with very high honors. John was pretty gifted in this college. He did very well for himself, and he graduated with such high honors that he was elected to be a teacher on that college in the college faculty, and was offered a very nice job with a very good pay there. But John would not accept this position, however, because for some time he had actually felt that God was calling him to ministry. And after many battle and a conversation with many people, John surrendered to be a missionary to India. And just a few months after he graduated, he, along with several other missionaries, who actually a lot of them were influenced by John, after John accepted the call to become a missionary, he was instrumental in being an influence to many other people to become missionaries. But he and a group of several other missionaries, several months after he graduated, was on a boat heading to India to serve the Lord, and John's life just seemed to be falling into place perfectly. Everything was going well for him to serve God. It was just going to be a wonderful time serving God in India. John had plans, but there was just one problem. John wasn't saved. You see, all of John's life, he had wanted to be a missionary. When he was very little, he wanted to be a missionary. That was what he wanted to be. And to quote in his own words here, he said, "My father was a minister, and my mother was a very devoted Christian with a beautiful voice which had been consecrated to the Lord." He said, "I determined when I was a youth to be a missionary, and a quote-unquote good missionary. I wanted to shine as a great missionary. That was my ambition." But sadly, it was the ambition out of which he left the main factor, God. And John, he said later on, this was perhaps not altogether of the flesh, but most of it was. And John, like many others, he loved the work of God. He loved to do ministry. He loved all of those things. But he did not personally know the God of the work. And he wanted to witness to people. He wanted to rescue the perishing. He wanted to see sinners get saved, but he never experienced that salvation for himself. And soon, John was to face that grim realization on his way to India. He said later, recounting on his voyage to India, leaving New York, he said, "When I got on board the steamer at New York, bound for India for my life work, I found in my cabin a letter addressed to me. It was in the handwriting of my father's friend, and I opened and read it. And this minister friend, we don't exactly know his name, and there are some assumptions to it, but John and his father knew this minister very well, and they were very good companions. John and this minister were very good friends, and this minister cared for John just like he was a brother. They were very close to one another, and this is why he wrote this letter in John's cabin. And it was short, but the words had a very profound and very moving impact on Hyde's soul. And the writer led this. I'll read it to you. It said, "I shall not cease praying for you, dear John, until you are filled with the Holy Spirit, or in our words, until you are saved." John said after reading this letter, he said, "My pride was touched, and I felt exceeding angry, crushed the letter, and threw it into a corner of the cabin, and went on the deck in a very angry spirit." And one of John's biographers put it best when he said, "John was going as a missionary," he told himself, "and it was presumptuous for him to go without being filled with the Holy Spirit. He was headed for the top, was he not? I mean, that's what John wanted. He wanted to be a great missionary. He was headed for the top. He was going to be written down with those other great names in history as important men that God had used throughout the years. But John came to the conclusion after reading and fretting for many a time that, and in his own words, he said, "I still felt annoyed, but the conviction was gaining on me that my father's friend was right and I was wrong." And eventually, John came to the conclusion that he indeed was wrong. And on that trip to India, on his way to become a missionary, to become one of the greatest men that God had ever used, was his plans, it was on that voyage that John got saved and accepted the Lord as his Savior. Now, after this, after John was saved on his voyage, he gave up all his previous ideas of his career of being a well-known missionary. He gave that up. That wasn't important to him anymore. He didn't care about his ambitions. He didn't care about his personal desires. And he told God that he was willing to do whatever he wanted him to do. And if that meant staying out of sight, being a silent worker in God's army, he was fine with that. He would do whatever God wanted him to do. And so he did just that. He stayed out of sight, and he was a silent worker for many years. And though he worked very quietly, there was no doubt he was a faithful worker. John, he loved the Indian people that he came to minister to, and he loved them to death, and he was burdened for them, and he worked faithfully among those people. And though he was a faithful worker, and though he loved God and the people, no doubt, really people looked at him, and one person said he didn't really show, any great potential to be, some wonderful man for God to use. He was just a good worker who loved God, loved the work. And he was just that, just a good, quiet, faithful worker. Nobody really expected anything wonderful to come out of John Hyde's ministry, but God had other plans for him. Though John had said he didn't care about being a well-known minister or anything like that, and he didn't care about being wrote down as one of the greatest men, or written down, I'm sorry, that's my country grammar kicking in, but he didn't care about having fame or anything like that anymore. He told God that, and he was sincere in that. But God had other plans for John. And it was during all this time, during his silent ministry, as it's called, that he was being molded, and God was preparing him for much greater work than he could have ever imagined. And one of his biographers said concerning this time, he was not to climb those golden stairs of prayer fame at once, but it was to toughen the fiber of his soul through trust amid difficulties through which the eye of faith could not pierce, and nights of haunting danger, and hours of praying face down. But John went about those duties that he had, faithful in the small responsibilities, willing to be unknown worker in God's enterprises. And he did that, as I said, for many years, working faithfully, rescuing the perishing, and just being a good and unknown worker in God's army. But in 1904, almost 12 years after his arrival, is when John Hyde really became known by his more popular name nowadays, Praying Hyde. And it was during that year, 1904, that there was a bit of a spark of revival at Sialkot, which was the headquarters of the United Presbyterian Mission there in India. And the leaders there felt a very desperate need for a move of God. They were very burdened for the people and for the workers for the people. They were a burden for all of them. And in April, a call went out there from Sialkot for prayer warriors to gather in prayer for India before God. And Hyde, of course, was one of the leading figures in this movement of prayer. And from the very start, he was a very crucial part of this union. And you have to think, some of the greatest men and women of prayer were gathered here at this meeting, but Hyde stood out from all of them, and his habits and just his life and his prayer life especially in and of itself were very challenging to all of those around him. And of all the people there, Hyde probably spent more time than anyone else there in prayer. And as a result of this Punjab prayer union, a call for a Christian Life convention went out at Sialkot, and after the meeting was over. And John was so burdened for this upcoming convention that he, along with another man, now a lot of people are going to say, this sounds crazy. It doesn't seem like it can be done, but there are records, and you can say this was a true fact, that John was so burdened for this meeting that he, along with a close companion, spent 30 days and nights in nonstop prayer for that meeting before it ever started. And people thought it to be impossible. And when people would look at them, they say, how are they doing it? But Hyde was so burdened for the people that he would not stop. He could not stop. He was burdened for these people. He did not want there to be any lack of spirituality in the meeting, as he put it. And even after that great feat, praying for 30 days and 30 nights, Of course, it took a toll on their body. I mean, they didn't eat or drink during that time. It was all prayer. And even after that, during the convention, they spent much time, John and his companion did, in prayer. And they were often interceding throughout the whole thing for the people there in the meeting. And one of the Indian ministers in that meeting, who knew Hyde well, remarked, "When I see this man from another country so burdened for my people, I feel ashamed when I think of how little I'm doing for my own flesh and blood, my own countrymen," he said. And it was no wonder when you looked at the life of John Hyde. The man was a living, walking man of prayer. I mean, a man once said that John Hyde prayed as if God was at his elbow, because he was. And John, he was just a phenomenal man, and everybody after this, they knew it. He wasn't just a silent worker anymore. He was the prayer warrior of India. It was no wonder that God blessed that convention and blessed Hyde's ministry afterwards. It was no wonder. And Hyde, after that, for the rest of his life there in India, his ministry was pretty much the same. He would spend all day ministering and working among the people in the villages of India, and then he would spend the entire night praying for them. And that wasn't just a couple days of the week thing. That was all day, every day of his life. Hyde would go 2 to 3 weeks running off only maybe 3 hours of sleep at most. And people asked him, literally the local villagers there, they said of Hyde, he is a god in and of himself. Of course, Hyde would rebuke him for it, but they thought he was a god. And people asked, "How do you do what you do?" And he said, "It's not me." He said, "I've just learned to tap into the wellspring of God's strength." He said, "It's him that allows me to do all of this." He said, "I can't do this in and of myself." But that's what Hyde would do. He'd minister all day, pray all night, and of course, he would always he reaped a great bountiful harvest there while he was in India. And he got to the point in his life where he would pray for a certain number of converts each and every day of his life. And God answered the prayer, often giving him more converts than he asked for. He started off asking for 1 convert a day. Eventually, he went up to 4 converts a day. And God was always faithful to meet that request. And he often, as I said, gave him more than he asked for. Sometimes gave him 5, 6, 10. Of course, great movements. He gave him even more converts. And I'm not just talking about little, make a quick profession and they live a sinful life. I'm talking about people, they gave up their idol worship. I'm talking about people that gave up everything and joined Hyde in serving God and ministering. This was a man who, somebody put it best, they said he matched his heartbeat with God so that he could live like God. He wanted to reflect God off all of his life and off of his life there in ministry in India. And he served in this manner for 18 years, faithfully doing so. But then after those 18 years, they noticed Hyde began to ail a bit more than usual. And after a point, his sickness got so great they went to the doctor. And I'll read you, the doctor examined Hyde, and I'll read you word for word what the doctor said to Hyde. He said, your heart is in a serious condition. He said, "This is the most serious case I've ever run across." He said, "Your heart has been shifted out of its natural position on the left side to a place on the right through stress and strain. It is such a bad condition that will require months of strictly quiet life to bring it back to anything like its normal size." But John, he was too burdened. His calling and his burden wouldn't allow him to sit by and watch thousands of Indians go to hell while he did nothing. He couldn't do it. I believe even if he decided he was going to, I don't believe he could have. He was under such a burden. If you study his life, he was so burdened for those people. He loved them so much. And it was Hyde who prayed, just like many others did. He prayed, "Lord, give me India or I die." And that was his prayer throughout his whole ministry. And God granted him that request. He gave him many converts out of India, and he reaped a bountiful harvest. But John, he couldn't stop praying. He couldn't stop being burdened for the Indians. And could not sit by and watch them as they went to hell. So he continued serving as he always had, praying, witnessing, working. Many were saved after that doctor's appointment. Probably would never been saved if John had took the doctor's advice. And also many people before that, after that, during Hyde's life and after his death by way of his biographies and whatnot, were provoked to a holy and a righteous living because of John's life. And John's life has been a great encouragement to me, and you need to find, there have been many biographies on his life, and you need to read them. They're fantastic material, each and every one of them. But he served faithfully, continued to do that, and it got to a point where his condition was so bad he couldn't serve, and so he knew he was about to die, and he wished to die in his home country. And so in February of 1912, Praying Hyde, the intercessor of India, died in his home country. And he would have been buried in India. However, I said it earlier, the natives, some of them considered him to be a god. And they said it, that if they had buried Hyde in India, that they would have made a shrine out of his grave. So Hyde did they regard Hyde. But so John Hyde died after 18 years of ministry in India. And, a lot of people will look at John Hyde's life and they say it doesn't seem a fitting description of the word greatness. They wouldn't say greatness was a characteristic of John's life. Most of the people would look at it and say it was a waste. They say he had opportunity to do something. He had an opportunity to accept a nice job back in the States. He could have done this. He could have done that. And it just seemed like such a waste. But to God, John's life was one of obedience to him, which is reality, the greatest measure of greatness that we have. And John's life was one that he spent trying to reflect the glory of God. And it was for that reason that on his deathbed, the last words he gave before passing off into eternity were, Bol Yesu Mashi Ki Jai, which translated to English means, shout the victory of Jesus Christ. That was the battle cry of John Hyde for his ministry. I pray it will be yours too. Hey, I appreciate you tuning in to today's episode of Reflections. Glad you did it, and looking forward to having you come back. We're looking forward to what God has in store for us here. And you remember, my friends, you keep pressing on the upward way, and I hope you have a great day.